Thanks for watching Spooky South Coast, and be sure to click the subscribe button and enable notifications with the bell icon to stay up to date with future videos.
It really shook people to the core. Whoever was killing the women could be someone they know.
Can you take us back to what it was like in 1988 when the story first broke?
You know, as we look back on the highway killings, we think of it as something that just burst out into the community that was ignored for a long period of time, because there had been that feeling in some circles that people didn't do enough because the women weren't wealthy, they weren't prominent, they were addicted to drugs. However, what we all forget is that in 1988, when this case first came out, it came out very, very slowly. When the first two bodies were found, people didn't even realize that there was a serial killer out there. The women hadn't even been identified. They weren't identified until December of 1988, and the first two were found in July. It was a very when the case first started, no one even knew that there was a case out there, if that makes sense, because it wasn't as if people knew that there were all these women had gone missing, because they didn't all go missing at once.
And
there weren't headlines about them going missing because they weren't like abducted in broad daylight. There wasn't anything immediately suspicious at the time. It came upon the community in a very, very slow process.
And it wasn't like, I mean, New Bedford had a lot of, you know, there was crime going on in the city at the time, but it wasn't a lot of, you know, it was very out of the realm to have multiple murders. Certainly not like it is these days, and I know that the mayor and the chief of police don't want to hear me saying that, but you know, now we have all these deaths that are happening all the time. We have drug addiction, the opioid crisis. You know, every day there's overdoses that are happening. But when a body was found in 1988, that was a pretty big deal and a pretty rare occurrence, right?
Well, it was, but you know, New Bedford was a fairly safe city in 1988, and you know, I still consider New Bedford still a very safe city today. It happens to be a city that doesn't ignore its crime, and that's what some other cities do. Because people care about the community, they care about the people that may fall victim to crime, they don't ignore it. In 1988, there was drug addiction. Heroin was a very serious problem in the community. There was an opiate crisis in 1988, but people just didn't talk about it. But with these many deaths, that was very, very unusual. There had always been murders in New Bedford, just as there's always been murders in similar cities of the same size as New Bedford. New Bedford wasn't unique in that. What New Bedford is unique, however, is how it approaches murders and the deaths of individuals. Generally, people do take notice because they know the people who have been who've been victims. They care about the people who have died. And I think even to this day, 30 years later, the community still does care about the women who died in 1988 because they haven't forgotten.
And Aaron, I know that you touch upon this a bit in the early parts of the documentary, but at that time, New Bedford was known for, you know, there was still recently in the news, Aaron, was the Big Dan's case.
Yeah, the Big Dan's case happened only 5 years before the highway murders case broke, so it was still relatively fresh in the minds of people. And we interviewed former Mayor Bullard, who said that because of the Big Dan's case, when he would travel around as mayor, the further away he got from the city of New Bedford, the more likely it was that somebody knew New Bedford for the Big Dan's case. And, you know, he thought that was unfortunate because he felt that New Bedford had a lot more to offer, which it did. And so by the time the highway murders came along, I mean, you know, I'm looking at this case from a retrospective perspective because I was only 5 years old and this is going on. So my research is talking to people, reading articles from various publications and watching the old news clips. And when the highway murders case broke and became prominent, probably in, you know, November, December of '88 is when it really started to heat up. You did see some mentions of Big Dan's, and, you know, highway murders cast harsh light on city that already had, you know, the problem of Big Dan. So that then it became a dual situation where people remembered New Bedford for two reasons at that point. It was both Big Dan's and then the highway murders case.
When did the movie come out? For those not familiar, the Big Dan's case was turned into that film, The Accused.
Yeah, The Accused came out in '88, and Jodie Foster won the Best Actress Oscar in '89.
So while this case is happening, that's in the spotlight, and New Bedford's getting mentioned in the press, and so it certainly kind of created a storm.
And that's one of the reasons also why the Big Dan's case really achieved that national prominence was because of the film. Mm-hmm. While the case was shocking for a number of reasons, one of them was the allegation that the accusers had said, you know, that she said the accusers were cheering like they were at a baseball game. That's what really caught the attention of the media, that one phrase. But the Big Dan's case would have died down if not for the film, and that's why people, let's say in California, knew about New Bedford because of the film more than anything else. So New Bedford became synonymous with Big Dan's because of the film, I think.
And so when the first victim is found in '88, and then, you know, this starts to make some news, obviously, because, you know, when you find a body, that's going to be news. But at one point, did the idea start to come about that, you know, this was the work of one person? How many victims were found before it started to become clear that there was a serial killer in New Bedford?
Yeah, the first two bodies were found in January, but the third body was not found until November. So the real concern, the real fear, didn't rise until after the third body was found in November. However, between July and November, other women with similar height, similar weight, similar background, and the background was drug addiction, they had gone missing. And one of the New Bedford detectives had noticed that there appeared to be a pattern of women who had gone missing, and that's when there was more concern out in the law enforcement community that there may be something else going on. But no one was really saying, yes, we have a serial killer on the loose in the summer of 1988 when some of the other women went missing, because they didn't know they had a serial killer out there, because there were not 9 women found dead in quick succession early on.
And Aaron, I know that you've spent a lot of time with the families in recent years, interviewing the relatives of the victims and really getting their story and helping them tell the story of their loved ones who were lost to this. Obviously, they care a lot about their loved ones that were lost, but did they get the sense, Aaron, that it was a lot of, like, the public sentiment was, oh, it's you know, it's just these women of questionable reputation? Did they get the sense that maybe the public didn't care as much as they should because of the stories that they were hearing about these victims?
I think to a degree that they felt that way. I think it's a little unfair I think some of the families are a little critical of law enforcement, where we've talked to a lot of the people that were very close to this case, and it's very obvious that, you know, the lead investigators, the guys like Josie Gonzalez, Marianne Dill, Richie Ferreira, they did care very, very much about the families of these victims in particular. So I think some of the criticism may be directed maybe sometimes in the wrong place, where there may have been other members of the media from further out that kind of portrayed it as strictly drug addicted prostitutes, whereas, you know, the local law enforcement in this area, they really did care. I mean, I think it was slow to develop to come to the realization that they were dealing with a serial killer, and I think that has a lot to do with the fact that that's a cat of a completely different color, a serial killer. New Bedford, yeah, it's got some issues and it can be a rough city, but they had never dealt with anything like this before. This is not something that happens in a lot of places. I mean, we interviewed Richie Ferreira, who was one of the primary investigators, and he said none of us had any experience dealing with what we would know as a serial killer. It was just a completely new experience and very different from anything that they had done before.
And Maureen, working in the community at that time, I mean, it's even now, New Bedford is still a pretty tight-knit community, but, you know, at that point in 1988, in the mid to late 1980s, we were seeing the mills start to close up. We were seeing kind of an economic downturn as we were on the verge of the recession that was coming. You know, New Bedford was a city that was definitely in transition, but at the same time, it was, especially reading the book, you can tell it was a community where people knew one another, and people generally, even if they, you know, didn't know one another, they tended to look out for one another. So this is somebody coming in and going after some of their own.
Yeah, and that was, I think, the most frightening thing for the community, because if it was someone in the community that did this, it really shook people to the core. Whoever was killing the women could be someone they know. And if it was someone they knew, how scary is that? If it's your neighbor, if it's someone that you went to school with, is it someone you went to church with, someone you've had an interaction with, if that person is the killer, how safe do you feel? And I think that was the one of the most frightening parts of the case. Even 30 years later, people have come up to me at some of the book events, and they are saying, they're relating to the case, saying how frightened they were because they used to drive those same highways. And while none of the women were killed on the highway, that's where the bodies were left, but people were relating to the case based on what they knew, situations that touched them. So in that regard, everyone in the community was touched by this case in some way, whether they knew the victims, whether they knew the families, whether they knew the locations. They were also very, very concerned about where this was going to end and how this was going to end and why was it happening here. New Bedford at that time was a fairly isolated city in the state. It was out of the Boston loop. Some of the movers and shakers, if you will, in Boston considered New Bedford the end of the universe. And that was something that someone had actually said back in the mid-'80s. They called New Bedford the end of the universe. So the deaths of the women did shake everyone in the community, did touch everyone, and they were also very, very concerned about how it was going to affect them, how it was going to affect their community, and who might be next. If someone can kill the most vulnerable people in your city, where do they stop?
Absolutely.
And I think in the back of everyone's mind, they're thinking of that. Does it end there?
Especially where
it's going to escalate.
Especially where it was a community where there was a lot of vulnerability during that time. Aaron, because you know you're in the studio, it's easier for me to look at you and kind of go one-on-one with you. Just some of the people in the chat room are asking for just a quick overview of exactly what happened in this case. And I know that that's kind of hard to put into a concise couple-minute answer, but if you can kind of just give people, you know, what would be on the back of the DVD, essentially.
Sure, and Maureen can probably correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, but essentially the women in New Bedford that were victims of the highway killer began disappearing sometime in maybe late March, April, and continued disappearing right up until early September. The first victim was found on July 3rd, and the second victim was found on July 30th, and there were still women disappearing after bodies had already been found. And one of the things that I find interesting about this case is that the last victim, Dawn Mendes, who disappeared on September 4th, was dumped only a mile from the Reed Road exit where they had already been. She was dumped at the Reed Road exit, and in July there had been a body dumped only a mile down the road. So if the killer was paying attention to the bodies that he was dumping, he still continued dumping bodies close to where he knew bodies had already been found, which to me is an interesting aspect of this case. But the women started disappearing in the spring, continued disappearing right up until early September, and then they continued finding bodies all the way up until April, late April of 1989, when they found the last body in Marion, which was Sandra Botello. And there were actually two presumed victims of the highway killer that have never been found, being Christina Montero and Marilyn Roberts.
So in total, how many victims are we looking at?
9 found, but 11 altogether, with 2 that haven't been found yet. Although, you know, to say that this was something that New Bedford hadn't seen before is a little bit incorrect. There were 4 other homicides dating as far back as 1985 that did have some similarities to the highway murders. The first one being September of 85 with a woman named Shirley Parton, who was last seen at a New Bedford bar, found beaten, strangled, and raped, shoved underneath an electrical generator on Herman Melville Boulevard. A year later, another woman named Dorothy Danielson was found beaten, strangled, bludgeoned to death, and sexually assaulted on the railroad track only a short distance from where Shirley Parton was found. So in 1986 already, I know that Detective Dextrator, who was the New Bedford detective that started putting pieces together early on the highway murders, already had it in his mind that those 2 murders may have been connected.